Today, we're tackling one of the most complex stories on Earth, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we're not going to look at it as a simple story of good versus evil. We're going to deconstruct it for what it truly is, a tragic collision of two legitimate national stories, a tragedy of two rights.
You know, this isn't a case of one history simply replacing another. It's more like two histories, two whole societies layered right on top of one single tiny piece of land. And this isn't some ancient religious grudge match. It's a modern clash between two peoples, both with deep, authentic connections to the same home, and both desperate for the right to determine their own future. So let's get one thing straight right from the start. While religion is a huge part of the identity for both peoples, you absolutely can't ignore it. This is not, at its heart, a religious war. At its core, it's a modern political conflict, born in the late 19th century, driven by nationalism, and fought over one finite piece of land.
What's wild is that these two national movements bubble up at almost the exact same time in history. On one side, you have Zionism, the Jewish people's movement for self-determination. It was born from centuries of violent persecution in Europe, making a sovereign state in their ancestral homeland feel like a matter of survival. And on the other, you have Palestinian nationalism, which grew from the native Arab population's own desire for independence. First from the Ottomans, then the British, and critically in direct response to the Zionist project, two parallel movements making competing claims to the very same home.
Okay, so to really get a handle on the politics, you first have to understand the pain. This isn't just a fight over maps and borders. It's a conflict driven by deep foundational traumas that literally shape the psychology of both peoples.
You know, there's a term for this. Some experts call it a clash of conflicting vulnerabilities. What that really means is that both Israelis and Palestinians often act from this profound gut-level fear, a fear of total annihilation or complete erasure. And those fears, they dictate their politics, their security doctrines, and why it's so incredibly hard to trust the other side. And those fears, well, they stem from two defining catastrophes. For the Jewish people, it's the Shoah, the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews forged an ironclad national imperative: never again. An absolute, non-negotiable need for their own state and their own army to defend themselves. For Palestinians, it's the Nakba, or the catastrophe of 1948. Their entire society collapsed, and over 700,000 people became refugees. This created their core principle, the right of return, a powerful demand for justice and the restoration of their homeland. Two opposite yet equally powerful national commands born from immense suffering.
So with those psychological drivers in mind, let's see how this actually plays out on the ground, in the fight for territory. How do these two national dreams actually collide on the map? All right, let's do a quick run-through of the key moments. It all kind of kicks off in 1917 when the British promised support for a Jewish national home. Fast forward to 1947, the UN proposes splitting the land. The Jewish leadership accepts, the Arab leadership rejects it. This leads directly to the 1948 war, what Israelis call their War of Independence and Palestinians call the Nakba. Then comes the real game changer, the 1967 Six-Day War. Israel captures the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, placing millions of Palestinians under military rule. And there was this brief glimmer of hope in 1993 with the Oslo Accords. But that process, well, it ultimately stalled out.
Now, this table really shows you the engine behind all that growing tension. In just 25 years under British rule, look at that, the Jewish population surged from about 12% to over 32%. Now, for Jews fleeing persecution, this was literally a matter of life and death. But for the native Arab population, this massive demographic shift felt like an invasion, fueling their deepest fears of being displaced.
Okay, hang on. Before we go any further, let's pause for a quick but really vital point of clarity. It's so important to distinguish between three different things: the state, which is the permanent institution, the government, which is just the temporary group in power, and the people, who are millions of diverse individuals. And this is the key takeaway here. Criticizing a government's policy is not the same thing as attacking an entire people or questioning their right to exist. This distinction is absolutely crucial.
All right, here's a key term you're going to hear a lot: the green line. This was the ceasefire line from the 1948 war. For almost 20 years, it was basically Israel's border. Everything changed in 1967. And today, that line is what separates Israel proper from the occupied Palestinian territories. And this image, wow, it makes that geography totally clear. You can see the green line, that's the pre-1967 border. Everything east of that is the West Bank. But look at the separation barrier. See how it snakes deep inside the West Bank, enclosing Palestinian towns and separating them from Israeli settlements?
This is the physical map of the occupation right here.
And here's the number that defines that reality today, roughly 700,000. That's how many Israeli settlers now live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, on land that was captured back in 1967. And just so we're clear, we're not talking about a few small outposts here. This is a massive civilian presence that has completely reshaped the landscape.
And this is why the presence of these settlements is so central to the whole diplomatic stalemate. The broad international consensus from bodies like the UN is that transferring your own population into occupied territory violates international law and is pretty much the primary roadblock to any viable two-state solution.
So, all of this brings us to the final and maybe the most difficult piece of the puzzle, the core impasse. And we're framing this not as a problem with a simple solution, but as a true dilemma, where fundamental rights are in direct opposition to each other.
So the real question is this: how do you possibly solve a problem when two core demands, both seen as fundamental rights, completely cancel each other out?
Okay, let's just lay it out side by side. On the Palestinian side is the right of return. This comes from a UN resolution, and it's the demand that nearly 6 million Palestinian refugees and their descendants have the right to go back to the homes and lands their families lost in 1948. For Palestinians, this is a matter of basic justice. But on the Israeli side is the absolute imperative of demographic security. I mean, the whole point of Zionism was to create one country where Jewish people were not a vulnerable minority. Allowing millions of Palestinians to return would make Jews a minority in their own state, effectively ending the Zionist project.
So for one side, that key to a lost home represents justice and the correction of a historical wrong. For the other side, that exact same key represents an existential threat that would dismantle their entire national project from within. It's a zero-sum game, and it's being played out on this fractured map.
And that brings us right back to our central idea. The reason this conflict has endured for so long, the reason it's so incredibly painful, isn't because one side is righteous and the other is evil. It's because both sides have a powerful, legitimate, and historically grounded claim. It is, in the truest sense of the word, a tragedy of two rights.
So, we'll leave you with this thought. In a conflict that's defined by two competing truths, can a single, shared future ever be built? Or is this collision of two rights just destined to continue? That remains the unresolved question at the very heart of this land.